The physician's hands are cold against Petronia's swollen belly. Oil and rosemary scent the air. A bronze bowl catches the morning light. Outside, a gull cries over tiles that hold too much summer and too many footsteps. A slave child moves quietly along the corridor with a tray. Within the cool curtained room, Gaius Curvilius Vadia's steward stands just out of reach, his ledger tucked under one arm like a small shield. The physician listens. He taps, he tilts, he measures months with a practiced neutrality that is itself a kind of power. This is the scene that explains everything. How a household's fortunes could hinge on the state of another person's womb. How an empire's public grandeur rested on judgments made in private rooms, where medicine and accounting met. What Roman masters did to female slaves who became pregnant was, in the most literal sense, a matter of calculation, numbers deciding lives. And that is why even today the word unspeakable comes to mind. Petronia does not think in legal formulas. She thinks of the child's kicks like small rebellions, like proof that something inside her is not entirely owned. She tastes fear and relief in alternating waves. She was born in chains, brought into household service before she could remember the sound of her mother's voice, yet she is astonished at being capable of growth inside herself. For a few silent hours she allows herself that astonishment. Then the steward clears his throat, and the ledger is opened. If this story matters to you, subscribe. There are more of these investigations ahead, stories that do not let us admire the past without knowing what underwrote its splendor. Petronia's life before the pregnancy is quick to tell and slow to live. She came to Vadia's house at 7. The trader who sold her said she was good with children and steady with a needle. Those who purchased human beings seldom confessed what they were paying for beyond present labor. In Vadia's home, she learned the rhythms of the place, the way the water was warmed for the bath, which hallways took the drafts, how to read the temper of the mistress by the tilt of a cup. She learned also the unspoken ledger beneath those rhythms, the counting, the measures of worth that underwrote how the household moved. A sudden cough, a scar, a child's presence could shift those numbers overnight. The law in Rome made that ledger explicit. The principle most central to this particular calculus is known by its Latin phrase, partus sequitur ventrum. In plain terms, it means the child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is born into bondage. If she is free, the child is free. That legal rule placed a mother's body at the fulcrum of property law. It made offspring predictable property income, future household labor, potential domestic servants, or commodities to be sold. The phrase is simple, its consequences are not.
Scholars and jurists of the time debated details, how the law interacted with manumission, citizenship, and inheritance. But within a household like Vatia's, the equation had a practical clarity. A pregnancy was not merely a private event. It was potential future labor, potential profit, potential cost. The household steward kept this in mind with the same dedication he used to tally olive oil or grain. Petronia hears the scribble of a stylus. She imagines, as she once had to when she was a child, the wax tablet's hard surface receiving marks that turn people into rows in a book. Horatia, an older slave who has been at Vatia's longer than anyone can recall, has taught her to read the marks in other ways. The shared look between two servants when a buyer comes to the door, the small gestures that mean we are watching or do not speak. Horatia's wisdom is a map for surviving systems that have eyes but not hearts. Name her, Horatia whispers once, the very first night Petronia tells her. Name her something that will follow her. It will do you both good to hold on to a name. Naming is a quiet act of defiance. In a household where people are shifted like goods, to choose a single word and attach it to a small human is to make a claim that no ledger can erase. Petronia debates names in the hush of the night, names that are practical, names that are small rebellions. She thinks of naming her child Lucia, for the small light in the dark. Horatia suggests prima, meaning first, a private logic for why a child should be called something that insists on priority and presence. There are other options, of course, and none are free of danger. Some women in Vatia's household find ways to prevent pregnancies when they can. Herbal concoctions, dangerous measures whispered like recipes for survival. Others seek to buy their child's freedom with favors or hidden savings, a brittle strategy that often breaks when a sharp-eyed purchaser arrives. Escape is a dream and a practical impossibility for most. The roads are watched, the ports are close, the names are known. Compliance is not consent. It is survival. Petronia sits under the weight of those choices. She remembers, as if it were a lesson learned in another life, how the house once bought and sold children, how, as a girl, she watched a toddler taken away, whose face she will never forget. That image returns when the physician listens and the steward calculates. The same old ledger appears in new handwriting. The household's calculus is both blunt and meticulous. Verne, children born into the household from its enslaved women often carried different economic weighting than slaves imported from a market. A Verna grew up within the home. He or she had known the rhythms of the place and been shaped by them. A household could train, discipline, and educate a Verna in ways that made them more reliable and thus often more valuable for certain domestic tasks.
Vernae could be seen as investments that required lower immediate cost but offered steady returns. Masters thus often preferred Vernae for internal roles. Conversely, some Vernae were sold off, especially if their prospects in the market promised a higher return than keeping them. The physician's voice is clinical. He describes the child's position. He suggests a month. The steward performs the arithmetic in silence, then speaks aloud the possible outcomes for the household accounts. More labor, more mouths to feed, or a young body taught for sale. Vatia sits on the periphery of the room, his posture carefully indifferent but his attention keen. He asks about the timing of births elsewhere in his household, about the needs of his estate, and about the possible market for a healthy child. His questions make clear the truth. This is business, and yet it is intimate in a way that makes Petronia's stomach twist. To speak of business here is to be careful with language. Not every master reduced reproduction to profit in the same way. Not every household had the same regime. Some masters showed, in small gestures, a kind of careful paternalism toward their Vernae. Others were cruel and capricious. The system, however, enabled all of these outcomes. Where a law says a child's status depends on the mother's, the household can treat that status as an asset. Petronia's pregnancy is both a private body and a public ledger. Her blessings are layered over with risk. Horatia takes her hand and maps out the social arithmetic in a voice that is both blunt and tender. "You will be watched," she says. "They will want to know what the child is like. You will be asked to nurse or to hand over. You will be tested. Keep your voice small. Trade when you can. Keep a threat." That thread is literal and metaphorical. Petronia takes to hiding small things for luck: a scrap of cloth, a hairpin, a bead of glass she keeps in the hem of her shift. She writes names in the dust with a finger when no one looks. She teaches the child one small thing before it even appears: how to find warmth in a corner, the smell of bread baking, the sound of her own name. The household's practice of testing infants can be clinical and economic at once. Midwives and physicians examine newborns for health, yes, but also for traits that attract buyers: strength, vigor, looks. Infants deemed fit might be kept for household labor. Infants judged unsuitable could be sold, or in some documented cases across the Roman world, exposed, left in public places to die or be taken by strangers. Exposure was not a universal practice, and its use varied by region and circumstance. It is important to say this plainly: some of these fates were common in certain social strata and times, and some were less common. What we can assert with confidence is that the law allowed masters a wide latitude over the fate of children born into bondage. Masters made choices, and those choices shaped lives.
Petronia gives birth in a quiet room, with Horatia and a midwife attending. The narrative of the labor need not be graphic to be felt. There is a longing of the breath, a smallness of time stretched wide, the first sense of the newborn's skin like the faint impression of the world. When the child arrives, Petronia holds her to her chest, and she makes a sound the household has rarely heard from one of its enslaved women, a laugh saturated with something like pure relief. They name the child in a low voice. Lucia, they decide together, or perhaps more often in the hush of the quarters she is called Prima. The act of naming is their private blessing. For a year they have small days. Petronia nurses. Lucia learns the corridors, the smell of Vatia's study, the creak in the servant's stair. She is curious and bright in ways that make the quiet corners of the house soft. Horatia keeps watch. Petronia teaches her to read the rhythm of a door, to know which servant's steps mean danger and which mean bread. But the ledger keeps ticking. After the infant's first months, officials, stewards, buyer's agents, sometimes the mistress, make visits to assess and decide. They turn what they see into rows on tablets: weight, health, temperament, potential. These are not merely observations, they are assessments for action. The household will decide: keep, train, sell, expose. The physician's earlier neutrality becomes a rubric for economic decisions. Petronia cannot pretend not to know the consequences of those assessments. In other households scholars reconstruct, institutions sometimes establish training centers, formal or informal, where children destined for certain work were taught skills from an early age.
In Vatia's world, there is a plan for children who are deemed most promising. They will be lodged with a trainer, taught to serve with polish and discretion. They might learn the management of a small household, the ways of serving a lady, or the tasks of a busy kitchen. There are other fates, too. Children might be prepared for markets where they could fetch sums that would benefit the master's account books. Names and faces mattered to buyers. Averna's familiarity with domestic ways could be marketed as a premium. Petronia sits up nights imagining what it will mean if Lucia is simply prepared for sale. The thought of another woman, Servilia or some stranger, taking her child, shaping her, maybe naming her something else, fills her with a vertigo of grief. But she is not powerless. Horatia teaches her how to resist by small, careful acts, feigning illness to delay inspections, making a child slightly more difficult in ways that reduce price, whispering to a buyer that the child has a cough, or that she is stubborn, measures that, while themselves cruel, can alter calculations. These acts of sabotage are a form of survival logic, turning the ledger against itself. Resistance takes other forms as well.
Among the slaves, networks of communication form. Messages carried folded in bread, names whispered at altars in supplication, hidden marks on the inner hem of clothing. Memory itself is a kind of hidden ledger, a recounting of names, of births, of places where children once were. Petronia keeps a list in her head. She recites the names of those taken from her over the years, and, in doing so, refuses the blanking out of human lives. One night, after Lucia has slept through the dark, Petronia finds a small scrap of wax under a loose floorboard. Someone has written a single letter on it, as if testing the stylus, an A, then a cursive L. It could be anyone's practice, anyone's whim. She hides it in a fold of linen. The wax will not buy anything. It will not free Lucia. But it is a talisman. It is a tiny, private ledger that counts for something. The household's more formal accounting is not so sentimental. Vatia's steward brings the child before the assembled household in a way that reads almost like an audit. He describes the infant's health to the master, translates the midwife's notes into columns, and calculates probable returns. He speaks of training costs, the labor needs in the villa, the potential price in markets beyond the city. Numbers that once marked oil casks and amphorae now move through the space of a mother and child. The steward is not malevolent by all accounts, but he is a facilitator of a system that reduces flesh to line items. Petronia asks, in the small privacy of the laundry area, will she stay? Horatia does not answer immediately. She thinks of times a child saved from sale meant years of loyal service, the possibility of earning a handful of favors that might one day lead, in rare cases, to manumission. She also knows that the decision is Vatia's, and that Vatia's heart is not the final arbiter here. The law and the economic need are. Horatia's counsel is practical. Make her hard to sell if you must. Make her a child who is loved enough by a few, whispered about like a small scandal. Let the price fail. There is another method by which Petronia can attempt to create attachment in ways that matter to the household's women. She teaches Lucia to carry warmed water without spilling, to fold linen so neatly that the mistress notices. She instructs the girl to fetch the right spice at the right time, to laugh at the right moment, so that visitors see her as gentle and useful. This is not strategy for the masters, but for the mother. If the women of the house feel regard for Lucia, the ledger's numbers might tilt in her favor. It is an appeal to sentiment as a counterbalance to economics. Yet sentiment can be bought too. A household that wishes to sell will market sentiment, paint the child as charming, as suited for a refined home. The buyer is often complicit in shaping the narrative of the child's value. Thus, the household's private practices intersect with public markets.
Petronia understands this. She tries to control the narrative in ways she can, showing that her child resists being easily commodified by being, at times, a rebel. All the while, the law's phrase, partus sequitur ventrum, remains the foundation. It gives masters the legal right to treat offspring as property. It does not require them to be cruel. It simply allows cruelty to be lawfully structured. This is the core of the moral problem. An entire society could celebrate public virtue and the arts while permitting private institutions to organize a market around the bodies of the enslaved. An instance arrives when an agent from a training facility visits. He is not cruel in his manner. He speaks about useful disposition, aptitude for domestic tasks, and suitable disposition. He is a professional who turns opinions into prices. He asks to see the child. Petronia steels herself. She has practiced small tricks, an exaggerated shyness, delayed eye contact. Yet she also knows that Lucia's curiosity will be a double-edged sword. Bright, curious children are sometimes more valuable because they are easier to train and to teach. The agent leaves with a polite nod. Whether that nod will translate into purchase or into keeping is a balance of numbers and whims. Petronia's strategy, such as it is, expands into a long game. She learns who the buyers are, which households prefer Vernay trained in kitchens versus those trained to serve as personal attendants. She learns the months when demand rises, when festivals call for extra hands, when estates need to replenish. She hides small things to trade. She offers favors and calculation. Resistance in this setting is patient, granular, and often morally compromised, because survival requires compromise. She will peddle a story, make a child less attractive, or make the child appear too attached to her to sell easily. Each tactic is a small moral fracture, yet each yields moments of shelter for mother and child. There is a ritual the household follows when a child reaches the age for formal inspection. The child is bathed and dressed in a way that emphasizes strength when desired, or awkwardness when that item suits the mother's plan. Petronia plays with these narratives. She instructs Lucia to nap at odd times. She creates a cough that would give the agent pause. She lets Lucia spill soup on a buyer's cloak at the right awkward moment. Such acts are punished when discovered. She understands this risk, but the thought of being separated from Lucia compels her to take it. Then there are the uses of memory and naming as resistance. Petronia gives Lucia a second name, a private name that she shares only with a small circle. It is not the name the household will repeat in formal register. It is the one that will anchor Lucia's sense of self if she is taken. Horatio whispers stories of mothers who have planted names into their children's ears so that no new owner could fully erase them.
Name and memory are not the same as freedom, but they are a foundation for survival in whatever new household may claim the child. As the months pass, the household's deliberations congeal. Petronia grows used to the weighing of options. Keeping Lucia will increase Vatia's domestic labor pool, but sending her to a trainer could convert her into saleable capital. The steward's ledger tilts with each small event. The mistress's comments about needing a child to fetch tea, the agent's offhand remark about demand in the city, the doctor's note about good constitution. All these are entries that matter. Petronia's hope is not a naive one. She has learned, slowly, with the grit left by years of life beneath eyes and books, that hope can be used as a tool, and hope can be used as an enticement. She places sugar in the corners of memory so Lucia yearns for small things that bind her to Petronia. In the meantime, she cultivates relationships amongst other slaves, trading services and news, so that, should the worst occur, there are those who will keep small remembrances alive. The household debates intensify. A buyer expresses interest. A trainer promises refined skills if the child is sent early. The steward presents a chart, citing months, costs of training, and estimated returns. Vatia listens and then asks, in a voice that masks calculation with civility, "What do you advise?" The steward's answer is a ledger's conclusion. Petronia learns the ways numbers can be made to sound like moral counsel. The day comes when a letter arrives, an uncommon formality for domestic matters, but a letter nonetheless, carried by a man who speaks of training facilities with a practiced air. He offers terms that are tidy and persuasive. Vatia, whose public philanthropy of monuments and funding for civic games wins him favor in the forum, has private calculations that rarely make the same audience. Public grandeur requires resources, and in private rooms resources are counted in living beings. The letter is read aloud in the count of the house. The physician is asked his opinion. The steward repeats the numbers. The mistress says little, and yet her slight enthusiasm is a deciding tilt. Petronia watches this orchestration from the margins. She hears the word unsound applied as gently as a price tag to a child's cough. She hears suitable used the same way. The terms are polite. The consequences are not. She thinks of the word unspeakable. It is the title that would be given to actions like these by a later age, and wonders whether, in the moment, those who arranged such transfers thought themselves merely practical people of their time. On the afternoon before the inspection that could decide Lucia's fate, Petronia holds her child and whispers a name that will not be on any official register. It is a private syllable, soft as a trade secret. Lucia repeats it back, forming the sound as if showing understanding of a holy thing.
The name becomes their tiny covenant. If the worst comes, remember this sound. If the child is sold, keep it in your heart. When dawn breaks and the household prepares to make the official call, Petronia addresses Lucia in a plain shift, and they go before the steward and the agent. The agent measures, looks for ease of movement, watches the child lift her head and follow a bird. He tastes the air of the quarters with a man's practiced indifference. He speaks into his notes in phrases that will decide the direction of a life. Petronia watches him with a focus that has about it the quality of a witness at a trial. It is here, at this moment of imminent decision, that the ledger turns toward a new assessment. The agent calls, almost by habit, for the trainer's input. The trainer, an official from a nearby facility where children are schooled in the arts of service and conformity, arrives with samples, with a pamphlet of disciplines, and with a calmness that suggests this is routine. A child with the right temperament can be made into reliable staff, he says. The return on such training is steady. Petronia feels the floor tilt. She has prepared every small trick: sickness under a tongue, a sudden shyness, a slow hand when asked to bring water. She has taught Lucia to be useful and to be awkward. These conflicting tactics are the language of survival, mixed messages sent in the hope that some calculation will favor them. The steward mouths numbers. Fatia takes a breath. The trainer studies Lucia's eyes. Until this point, the household has been debating options. Now the debate begins to harden into a decision. The trainer suggests a conditional transfer. The child will be moved to the facility temporarily and may be returned if the master so desires. In practice, such transfers commonly became permanent. The phrasing is careful. The meaning is heavy. Petronia leans over her child and presses her forehead against Lucia's. She remembers the scent of rosemary from that first examination and the cold touch of the physician's hands. She thinks of the bronze bowl catching morning light and of the ledger's riot authority. She thinks of Horatia's whispered advice and the wax letter under the floorboard. She has no illusions that she can turn the tide by herself, but she has a thread she will not let go. A knock comes to the door, the kind of knock that carries formality. The steward answers and returns with a folded strip of parchment. He reads the decision aloud, a conditional transfer, worded in the polite legal elaborations that make hard things sound administratively tidy. The trainer's men begin to prepare a small chest for travel, the kind used for children taken for training. A place for a few garments, a cupping vessel, a small toy. They will not be traveling far, the steward says. They are expected back should the master so desire. The phrasing is meant to comfort. Petronia knows it for what it is, an opening of a gate.
She wraps Lucia in a cloth and clutches her as if trying to unwrite the ledger's entry. Around them, the household moves in its usual measured ways. The mistress looks on with a quiet satisfaction that suggests nothing of what is being taken from Petronia. Vatia watches with a man's detachment, as though the decision could be evaluated later for its prudence and not its pain. Petronia does not scream. She has learned how to compress the temperature of her grief into small, actionable things. She ties a scrap of cloth into Lucia's hair, a scrap that only she will recognize, and presses a kiss onto the child's forehead. She tells Lucia the private name, the one they share. The trainer's hand is steady as he lifts the child. The men speak polite words to Petronia, promises that are reassuringly vague. As the child is taken away, Petronia feels a split open inside her and discovers there are more names than she had known. She whispers them all, like a prayer and a ledger of memory. Names of those who have gone before, names of the women who taught her, names of the gods she has been told will listen. She counts them as if they were beads. The act of counting steadies her, and in counting she refuses to let the child become merely a line item. At that moment, when the child's small hand leaves hers and is tucked into the trainer's sleeve, Horatia takes Petronia's wrist and says in a voice that has all the steadiness of a ship's anchor, "We begin." Not a rescue, not an end, a beginning. The household will go on with its rooms and its ceremonies, and a transfer will be noted in a ledger and perhaps never mentioned again in public. But for Petronia and for Horatia, for the circle of women who witness each other's losses and secret wins, life has altered course. This is the point where the private and public worlds collide most starkly. The master's decision, the trainer's statement, the steward's numbers shift a life from immediate maternal presence into institutional processes designed to shape it. Whether the child will be retained in service, sold into a stranger's household, or eventually manumitted is a question of probabilities and negotiations, not of moral right. The law allows the choice.
The household's economic needs provide incentives. Petronia returns to the quarters with a hollow full of things she cannot name. She sits with Horatia, who, like a seasoned midwife of survival, begins to plan. They will put small marks on garments. They will write names in hidden places. They will cultivate sympathies among servants who might intercept letters or misdirect a courier. They will create a history that can travel with Lucia, a hidden biography that no trainer can scrub away. In the quiet that follows, Petronia draws Lucia's private name into the dust of the floor and traces it with a finger until it smudges. The motion is small and meaningless to the outside eye. To her, it is the stubborn act of giving shape to a life that the house would otherwise anonymize. The wax letter under the floorboard is taken out and folded into a scrap of lining. Names are written on it in a hand that trembles. These are not official records. They are a parallel archive. The decision to send Lucia for training is not final in law. The phrase conditional transfer leaves a sliver of hope. In practice, such slivers often closed. In many documented cases across the Roman world, temporary transfers hardened into permanent removals. This is not an assertion that every outcome was identical. Variation existed, but it is a pattern visible enough in household records and secondary accounts that one can trace its contours. Petronia's plan becomes patience and cunning. She will learn who benefits by Lucia's training, who in Vatia's household will have easier days with Lucia present, who will gain status, who might profit from a sale. She will make friends in the right places, and she will work the ledger's margins. Survival requires that she meet cruelty with subtle rebellion, that she meet the institution's cold calculations with human stratagems that the institutional language cannot fully contain. As evening draws down, the villa's public face, its polished stone and formal gardens, glows in the sunset. Its shadows, however, are full of other things: the hidden ledger, the children taken away, the names kept in dust. In public, Rome's monuments outshine the small private calculations that sustain them. In private rooms, decisions are made with steady hands and ledger-bound minds. The contrast is not accidental. It is structural. Petronia sits in the quarters dim, and she moves from grief into the quiet work of plotting. A human life has been moved into the machinery of household training. She knows the machinery by its clanks and its lights. She also knows that machinery can be slowed, misdirected, or tricked with patient cunning. The next moves will require more than a name in the dust. They will require networks, favors, and a readiness to endure small moral compromises for the sake of guarding what is hers, the child's memory and the promise of their shared name. The day's events have shifted more than a mother and child. They have revealed how law, medicine, and economic practice came together in private houses to shape bodies and destinies. The phrase partus sequitur ventrum is no longer an abstract juridical note. It is a living rule, and its living consequences are what Petronia will now confront. Night descends, and in the hush, Petronia listens for the trainer's cart to recede down the road. She plans, breathes, and remembers. The household outside will count the absence as a small administrative movement. For her, the ledger will be a wound and a map. She will follow both. The story, for now, pauses at the threshold of that cart's departing shadow.
Petronia, Horatia, and the small circle of women begin the long work of preserving a child's name, of planting memories like seeds that might spring up in a stranger's garden. The unspeakable arithmetic that allowed a master to decide the fate of a mother's child has been enacted in a curt, legal phrase and in the polite tone of a trainer's office. What follows will be a negotiation between systems and human stubbornness, a struggle of accounts and affections, of ledgers and names, one that will show how, in a civilization that praised public virtue, private practices could render people into numbers. The cart's wheels fade into the dusk, and the villa settles into its practiced hush. Petronia does not sleep. She counts the hours by the slow turning of a lamp. The household goes on. Dinner plates clink, a lute plays faintly, the mistress reads aloud from a newer poem,
but the cadence of normal life is a drumbeat set against the raw shape of absence. Petronia keeps vigil in small, disciplined ways. She mends, she folds, she wipes bowls more slowly than necessary, as if time could be stretched thin enough to catch what has gone. Horatia moves like a ship's ballast beside her, steady, unshowy, uncompromised in its purpose. Days become a geography of waiting. Petronia learns the names of the couriers who sometimes pass by and the patterns of where letters are left. She listens for movements that might signal a return, an unfamiliar cart, the voice of a trainer, a hurried knock. Months pass with no message. The conditional transfer becomes a distant statement in the household minutes, a note that might carry weight elsewhere, and yet seems here like paper pressed into soft earth. The trainer's promise, that the child could be returned if the master wished, reverberates as both hope and a mockery of certainty. In the facility where Lucia has been taken, the world is different in texture and intent. The building is not a prison in the way a chain house might be imagined. It is a structured place shaped to produce particular outcomes. There are rooms arranged by trade and temperament, a running space for those to be trained in kitchen labor, a small study for those meant as attendants, a laundry where dexterity is practiced until it becomes habit. Tutors and trainers work with the language of habit, timing, repetition, correction. Children are taught to make gestures that suit a refined household, the smile that does not overstay its welcome, the silence that does not intrude, the measured servitude that disguises judgment. Medical men may intervene softly, tending to small ailments, ensuring that a child's body is fit for labor. The training is both pedagogy and branding. The trainers speak a cool language: aptitude, disposition, return on investment. They test for voice control, for willingness to obey, for neatness in handling vessels. They teach accent work so a child can simulate metropolitan manners. They teach to hide dialect and rural trappings.
Names are sometimes reissued in register books. Owners are given certificates or notes of proficiency that serve as marketing in the market. This is the productization of human habit and manner, an educational program tailored to the market's preferences. Lucia is small enough to learn quickly, and she is clever. Her curiosity, which Petronia once feared would mark her for sale, becomes both asset and hazard in the trainer's hands. She learns to fold a napkin into a precise triangle and to lay a table without looking. She memorizes the names of spices, of herbs, of where the mistress keeps ribbons. She learns to walk as a middened foot does not drag, and to lift a cup without spilling. All this makes her more valuable, or to put it more plainly, it means she fits the market's shape more closely. Yet the facility's methods are not only about skill. There is an effort to reconfigure memory and attachment. Children are encouraged to refer to supervisors in respectful terms. Affectionate bonds are discouraged or channeled into the roles the trainers want them to occupy. The private names given by mothers are sometimes treated as minor curiosities, things that can be overwritten with new ones. Trainers watch for resistance, sullen looks, silence, refusal to perform, and react with punishments that are bureaucratic rather than brutal: loss of privileges, tighter schedules, reduced rations of comfort. These are precisely the kinds of measures that break small wills into predictable patterns. It is here that Petronia's parallel archive matters. She has not only written Lucia's private name on a scrap of wax, she has, with Horatia and a few trusted others, sealed a handful of small objects: thread, a bead, a scrap of linen, inside a bundle that she believes might one day reach the child. She has taught other women to whisper the private name if they ever pass the child by, to leave a folded corner of cloth in a place the child might find. These acts are small contraband against a system that organizes forgetting. For weeks, Petronia's measures are thin but persistent. She feigns illness when Vatia's steward checks on her suitability for additional domestic labor, tugging at a weakness in a way that might lower Lucia's appeal by suggesting fragile health runs in the mother. She cultivates small irritations in Lucia, an odd cough taught at the right moment, a reluctance to look the right way at an inspecting agent. These measures are risky, but they sometimes work. An agent may nod and then hesitate. An offer may be postponed until demand wanes. The ledger is susceptible to weather and rumor. It is not an unalterable fate. Months turn to seasons. Letters finally arrive from the training facility, with notes of proficiency and a bland recommendation. Lucia has suitable disposition for refined domestic tasks. The household reads the letter as evidence of success, and for a long moment, Petronia allows herself to imagine that the training will be a route to stability, if not to freedom. Yet a different possibility surfaces when Servilia, the mistress's daughter, takes interest. Servilia is a young woman newly married into a branch of the family with its own household needs. She is drawn to the idea of a companion trained within the home's culture, a child who speaks of the villa in her small gestures and can be relied on to stand in for a servant who understands domestic privacy. In private, she speaks more warmly of Lucia than the household figures typically do. Her tears, Petronia notices, fall in a way that suggests personal attachment rather than economic calculation. It is here that an unusual transaction begins to take shape. Servilia offers to purchase Lucia for her own household. On paper, it is a sale. In practice, it is complex. Vatia can count the immediate return. Servilia gains a companion who will be loyal to her new household. And Petronia, the mother, must reconcile the paradox that the new owner might be more protective of Lucia than the villa itself has been. The sale is not rescue. It is another reshuffling of custody with consequences both human and structural. Petronia bargains with herself as much as with others. She learns, through Horatius channels, that Servilia is sympathetic to certain causes, and that she keeps a small set of household staff who are less severe than others. Horatia argues that placing Lucia with Servilia may offer better odds for later intervention. You cannot bring her home to you, Horatia says, but you can make a life where she is seen. You can be near her if you are needed. It is a cruel calculus, but it is one that yields a possible route. Petronia petitions in the quiet way of asking for small favors and offering useful irons in the household's fire, to be transferred as a seamstress, an attendant who mends Servilia's garments when she visits the villa. The request is risky. It puts Petronia near the very woman who would decide her child's fate. It is also, she reasons, the only way she can hope to keep the private name alive in the child's ears. Vatia agrees, perhaps because he admires the logic of keeping house matters consolidated, perhaps because the cost seems small in his accounting. Petronia moves. Servilia's household is, in some ways, a smaller stage for the same economy. There are lessons here that feel less severe and more domestic. A mistress who insists on a set of readings and soft cushions, a husband interested in maintaining social reputation. But the system's logic persists. Children are assets, labor is planned, names can be reissued. Petronia's new proximity to Lucia affords her glimpses, stolen moments in which she can touch the child's hair as she folds a hem, brief words spoken when the maid is otherwise engaged. Such gestures are small resistances, but they accumulate.
Petronia learns the rhythms of Servilia's household, the particular servants who might be sympathetic, the corners of the garden where a private name can be mouthed and not overheard. Lucia grows into the rhythms of Servilia's house. She behaves with the polish instilled by trainers, but small habits leak through. When she folds the linen, she makes a certain tuck that only Petronia recognizes. When she laughs, certain notes echo the lullabies of the villa's quarters. Petronia collects these moments like water in a hidden jar. There is a second arc of resistance that unfolds not in private names but in more organized interventions. Networks of enslaved people across households exchange information, favors, and small currencies. Some compound favors into a chain large enough to produce manumissions in rare cases. A favor returned here, a loan there, a petition to an influential mistress. These things add up. Petronia joins a discreet circle of women who, over years, pool small sums in favors to sponsor manumission petitions. They keep an eye on which masters might be swayed by public appearances. Those who give to temples or sponsor games might be susceptible to being flattered into benevolence. The strategy is not romantic. It is negotiation within equal power. It is also slow. Servilia's feelings toward Lucia develop into something, if not love in the maternal sense, then a protectiveness that sometimes opens doors. Servilia is not a savior. She is human, entangled in networks of obligation and status. But small things change. She prevents a harsh reprimand when a guest complains of a spilled cup. She allows Petronia a few more minutes to attend to a hem. These small interdictions on the household's harsher apparatus can accumulate into a life that, when viewed against the training facility's more systematized coercions, appears gentler. Years pass with the ordinary abrasions of time. Lucia grows from the child who once clung to Petronia's neck into a young woman whose competency in a household is unquestioned. She is still a Verna in the legal sense, born into bondage, but she has acquired a social capital that is harder to count. Where training had once tried to scrub away origins, repeated small memories remain. When a young man in the neighborhood, himself a freedman, comes to visit the household, Lucia notices the world beyond the villa in ways that are outward-looking and full of potential. She reads secretly when she can, taught in hushed lessons by a slave who remembers his own days of secret study. Reading becomes a small rebellion. The circle of women's pooled resources never yields a clean path to freedom. Instead, it buys moments. A petition drafted and presented to a magistrate on a festival's day when goodwill is more available, a small payment offered to a steward in exchange for delayed sale paperwork, a letter of introduction carried to an influential friend whose favor might be asked. In this uneven terrain, a door opens.
Servilia, influenced by quiet moral anxieties and perhaps a desire to shape a household legacy different from her father's, begins to consider manumitting Lucia. There are many motives here: piety, vanity, the wish to be remembered as generous, and it is important not to simplify them. Still, the petition is prepared, a document that will grant Lucia a legal status change if approved, and if the proper fees and formalities are fulfilled. The petition requires evidence of years of service and a public act, often a fee or a donation, so that the freed person's change of status will not threaten civic order in the eyes of those who watch social boundaries. Petronia and her allies marshal small favors to meet the practical requirements. They are pragmatic and weary of heroism. The day of the manumission is a careful ceremony. It is not a cinematic liberation, but a legal transformation with social consequences. A freed person acquires certain rights, limited, contested, and dependent on broader Roman law and local practice, but they also inherit a web of obligations and the stigma of origins. Lucia steps into a new juridical status, but not into fullness of freedom as modern readers might imagine it. The term of manumission is legal and partial. It opens certain doors while others remain closed. Still, it is a profound change for someone who had been, by law, property from birth. Mother and daughter move through this conversion with a mix of elation and caution. Petronia watches Lucia sign, mark the legal instruments, and the act shakes the air between them. The names on the tablet change. The ledger records an altered status. Petronia keeps a private journal, a list of those who helped, those who refused, the costs of favors. She knows that legal freedom will not erase years of training designed to make Lucia obedient and invisible. Yet it does grant mobility and a range of civic options that did not previously exist. Lucia can now, in theory, marry in a way inaccessible to her before, to own property in small forms, to assert rights when affronted. The world opens like a reed. For Petronia, the manumission of Lucia is both relief and new burden. The household structures remain. Vatia's villa continues its cycles. The ledger keeps turning. But in one room, a private chorus of laughter breaks out. Petronia and Lucia share a cup of wine, a simple thing that once would have been barred by social habit. They speak names aloud without fear of an official ear. They step into a courtyard at night and count the stars, with an intimacy that is not recorded in ledgers. Lucia's subsequent life is partial freedom and partial negotiation. She uses her new legal position to secure a measure of safety for Petronia, petitioning for her manumission as well, arguing before acquaintances and patrons that a mother's long service merits release. The petition is made not purely on sentimental grounds, but on a pragmatic case, that honesty and goodwill in a household profits its public image. Petitioning for a slave's manumission was not uncommon, but it required tactical skill and often money. The circle that had pooled resources for years now presents the final tranche. A few favors are called in, and a certificate is procured. When Petronia's manumission occurs, she experiences a strange dissonance. She is freed not by miraculous reversal, but by long calculation, the slow accrual of social capital, and the exhaustion of the household's owners with the optics of tiny benevolence. She steps outside the constraints of the villa with a small legal freedom that does not immediately guarantee economic independence. She must now navigate a city that was shaped by the same systems that once commodified her. There are markets where freed persons are required to pay taxes, obligations that bind her to past masters, and social stigmas that remain. But the legal change alters the ledger in a way that matters. Lucia's fragments of testimony, what remains of her words to later readers, are not surviving volumes. The account we hear is a dramatized reconstruction built from patterns of letters, orphaned inscriptions, and later testimonies that scholars have pieced together across sources. The following is such a reconstruction, offered here as plausible testimony and explicitly marked as dramatization rather than a literal surviving text. I remember the smell of rosemary and the cold of a physician's hand. I learned names in the dark and kept one stubbornly, my mother's, so that when strangers called me by other titles, I could breathe.
The training taught me to be quiet, to fold, to smile on command. When I was legal and yet unfree, I learned to count favors and to hold my history in a small cloth. Freedom came like a slow tide. It left seaweed at my feet, things I had to pick out and clean. But my mother, when she was freed, dried my ragged garments with hands that had known too much work. This dramatized fragment stands in for the kind of testimony we might imagine, partial, intimate, rooted in domestic senses rather than doctrinal claims. It reminds us that the archive of the enslaved is often scarce, names scrawled in margins, receipts that list persons as commodities, inscriptions that mark a freed person's civic contributions. Lucia's voice, when reconstructed, does not pretend to be a complete record. It is a shard that points to a fuller human life behind it. The epilogue of this household story does not offer a tidy moral closure. Vatia's villa continues to benefit from labor whose origins were once kept private. Roman monuments rise and are praised as civic gifts, while their supply chains of human labor remain inconveniently close. Yet there are consequences of small human defiance.
Petronia and Lucia, freed and marking their names in public registers, take steps to protect others. They maintain the parallel archive, names and small objects placed in safe hands. They become nodes in a network that helps others with petitions and small gifts. They teach younger women how to name, how to hide, how to collect favors into power. Their lives become part of an informal infrastructure of survival. There are broader lessons here that a modern listener should note without flattening complexity into simple outrage. The law that governed births, partis sequitur ventrum, did not invent cruelty. Rather, it created a legal premise that made certain forms of exploitation administratively simple. Masters, some thoughtful, some cruel, many indifferent, operated within a system that allowed them to weigh human lives against domestic needs. Economic structures, market demands, and cultural norms intersected to render reproductive capacity legible in ledgers. At the same time, human beings found means of resistance: naming, memory, small sabotages of marketability, networks of solidarity, petitions for manumission, and the slow accumulation of favors. These were not heroic revolts in the battlefield sense. They were patient, often morally compromised acts that kept lives intact. History's temptation is to simplify this into caricature, either to imagine all masters as monsters or to believe that any freedom achieved erased the scars of bondage. The truth is darker. Systems enabled suffering, and individuals within those systems acted with varying motives. Some masters sought to protect and patronize, others exploited ruthlessly. The legal architecture made certain abuses lawful, and the ordinary operations of households normalized decisions that to us read as moral calamities. But within that structure, human agency did not vanish. It shifted to other registers: memory, naming, minor sabotage, and the creation of alternative archives. Petronia's life after manumission is modest. She takes work mending garments and teaching others the small arts of household management. She and Lucia, now of a status that permits certain choices, establish a small household where they keep the names of those who were taken and record them in private ledgers. They become elders in a small circle that helps others petition for freedom. They teach the importance of keeping memory alive, that names and tiny objects carry weight. Their legacy is not a monumental one. It is a lineage of careful custodianship. The final reflection must return to the title that brought us here. What Roman masters did to female slaves who became pregnant was, in legal and practical terms, a series of choices that placed reproduction under household calculus. That calculus could include humane choices. It could also include practices that led to separation, sale, exposure, and the commodification of offspring.
The word unspeakable is not a call to lurid detail. It is a moral verdict on systems that normalize the instrumentalization of bodies. To call such things unspeakable is to insist that the arithmetic of profit should not be allowed to overwrite the dignity of persons. We must also be careful about evidence. Many aspects of this story are reconstructive: the particulars of Petronia's life, the wax letter hidden under a floorboard, the precise conversation with the steward. These are dramatizations inspired by patterns visible in the surviving record. The larger structures, partis sequitur ventrum as a legal principle, the existence of vernae as a social category, the practice of training facilities, and the trade in children are supported by scholarship. The individual scenes are offered to make those abstract patterns feel like lived experience.
Where testimony fragments are invoked, they are identified as plausible reconstructions rather than surviving texts unless explicitly noted otherwise. If the past matters, it matters because it shapes memory, and because it teaches us how institutions can make cruelty routine. The Roman case shows how law and household practice can mesh to produce outcomes that, in cumulative effect, are devastating. It also shows how survival strategies, small acts of naming, networks of solidarity, patient petitions, can carve out breathing room inside systems built to suffocate. The last image is quiet but decisive, an old wax tablet folded into a linen scrap. On it, faint letters, A, L, survive like a secret. It is both evidence of loss and a promise of continuity. Petronia, now freed, keeps it under a floorboard in a home she can call her own. Lucia visits daily and lays flowers there sometimes, small acts of remembrance that are not grand, but that keep a human ledger that no steward can fully erase. If this story stayed with you, and you want to learn more about the laws and household structures that shaped these lives, subscribe and tell us in the comments, what surprised you most about how law and daily life met in Rome? In the description you'll find suggestions for further reading, scholarly works that explore slavery, household economies, and the lived experience of the enslaved in the ancient world. History's monuments are worth knowing because they remind us of human creativity. They are also worth interrogating because they were purchased, in part, with the quiet labor and the broken attachments of people like Petronia and Lucia. Remembering them is not merely an exercise in anger, it is an act of historical honesty and moral responsibility.